All right, anatomy students, welcome back to the video lecture series. As always, I am your simple anatomy teacher, Mr. Grippa, and we're going to get finished with the last video in the series on the skeletal system tissue. Today we're going to talk about bone formation and exercise, and we're going to list and describe some of the different kinds of joints or articulations that we find in our bodies. So let's go ahead and get this educational ball rolling. All right, exercise and bone tissue. Under mechanical stress, bone tissue becomes stronger through deposition of mineral salts and production of collagen fibers by the osteoblasts. Remember, on previous lessons, I mentioned that stress on your skeletal system, either by working out or lifting, or sometimes even an injury, will cause your body to strengthen the skeletal system in that area with the work of the osteoblasts. If you lift weights and your muscle mass increases, you become stronger. That will put more tension and stress on the bones, and your body will respond by strengthening those bones by making them bigger and thicker. If you've been in the science class next door with Miss Mosley, you've talked about how bones can be, their size and weight will give you really good evidence as to whether or not the bones you are looking at are from a male or a female. Males typically have larger muscle mass, so their bones are going to be bigger, thicker, and more dense to help support that increase in muscle mass. Unstressed bones, on the other hand, become weaker. When astronauts go to space and they spend extended periods of time in weightlessness, there is very little stress on their skeleton. So, because their body wants to adapt to that environment, there's no need to have those stronger bones. So in space, their bones will become weaker, and they've tried to use different forms of exercise while they are up there to try to keep their bones strong, but it just doesn't work. It helps, but they still will get weaker bones. That's why they always put them on a stretcher when they return from space. When you can move, in weightlessness, you can move a 2-ton object simply by pushing it. If it has no weight, then any force acting upon it can move it. The arm in the space shuttle that they used to use on Earth wasn't strong enough to support its own weight, but in orbit, while in atmosphere, it could move large satellites and different heavy payloads right out of the cargo bay, because in space they have no weight. And that's why it's called weightlessness. It has no weight. So without that stress on their skeleton, their bones will become weaker. The main mechanical stresses on bone are those that result from the pull of skeletal muscles and the pull of gravity, which is what I just explained. Aging and bone tissue. A decrease in bone mass occurs as the level of sex hormones diminishes during the middle age, especially in women after menopause. And there are a lot of commercials, I'm sure you've seen them, where they are selling products that help women metabolize that calcium so that their bones don't become weaker. All right, here's a classic example. I'm sure many of you know of an elderly person who has fallen down and broken their hip. What actually happens is they land on their side, and most of the time there's a large process on the top of the femur called the greater trochanter. If you reach down to the outside of your hip and push in, you can feel there's not a lot of tissue there that when you reach down and feel on your hip, you're rubbing the greater trochanter on your femur. So when an elderly person falls, they land on that greater trochanter and the neck of the femur breaks. The head is now separate from the body of the femur and is stuck in the acetabulum or the socket on the pelvic bone. And that is how they quote unquote break their hip, when really they break their femur. But it always, as a younger person, I was always amazed. How does somebody fall down and break a hip? I fall down all the time, and I haven't broken any hips. How does this happen? And the reason is, as they get older, their bones become weaker and more brittle. And that's how they just fall and break a bone, and as opposed to just fall and get up and walk away. That's the difference. Since female bones are generally smaller and less massive than males to begin with, old age has a greater adverse effect on females. So what that in essence means is their bones are smaller to begin with. So in the race to have smaller, more brittle bones, females in essence have a head start because their bones are already not as heavy as a male's bones. There are two principal effects of aging on bone tissue. One is loss of bone mass. The loss of calcium from bones is one of the symptoms of osteoporosis. And I have a picture coming up that will show you the difference. And brittleness. The collagen fibers give bone its tensile strength, and protein synthesis decreases with age. So those fibers there that give the bone its strength are lacking, and that's what makes them more brittle, and they break easier. The loss of tensile strength causes the bones to become very brittle and susceptible to fracture. So here's a picture of normal spongy bone and spongy bone that is suffering from osteoporosis. Osteoporosis is a condition where bone reabsorption outpaces bone deposition. So basically, the osteoclasts who are doing their job of clearing old bone matrix away don't stop working. The problem is the osteoblasts that lay down new bone matrix can't keep up. As you get older, they don't work as fast as they used to. So there's a loss of bone mass in that aspect, often due to the depletion of calcium from the body or inadequate intake. So here, let's take a look at the difference. So here we see the trabeculae of the spongy bone, and this bone is nice and solid and dense and looks to be very strong. If you come over here to the bone with osteoporosis, the osteoporotic bone, you can see holes and fissures. The trabeculae isn't as thick, and it clearly is just not going to be as strong. I mean, look at this big gap right here. That is very problematic. And you can actually see the bone is very brittle and thin in this area. And that's simply what happens. That old person falls down. That vibration, that energy is absorbed into this part of the bone, and it's just not strong enough to hold together, and it will break. Let's talk about the joints. And articulation. Anytime you see the word articular or articulation, or to articulate, it means moving at the joint or the joint itself, where two bones come together. This is a point of contact between two bones. It will also be a point of contact between cartilage and bone, or between teeth and your bone. And teeth are very bone-like, but they're technically not the same as a bone. So there are three major varieties, three main varieties of joints, and they are as follows. Immovable joints. These are where two bones come together, but they do not move. The classic example are the bones in your skull, and where they meet are called sutures. And if everything goes okay, those bones don't move. If they're moving against each other, something's wrong. You've had some serious head trauma. Slightly movable joints are your cartilaginous joints. So your symphysis, for example, the pubic symphysis, which is a disc of cartilage that are in between the two pubic bones on the front of your pelvis. Also, your intervertebral discs. Your spine is slightly flexible, but it doesn't bend the bones between the vertebrae. The amount of bend that you'll get between those bones is nothing like your elbow or knee. And that brings us to the freely moving joints, and I think that name is pretty self-explanatory. These are the ones where the bones freely move against each other. And this is where the ends of those bones will be covered in hyaline cartilage to reduce the friction between those two bones moving against each other. So here is a diagram of a freely moving joint. These are some of the things that you will see around the joint. Labeled here, we see the ligament. Okay, ligament is what holds bone to bone. So here is a bone, obviously, right here. Around the joint, you're going to have what is called the synovial capsule. And what makes that capsule is the synovial membrane. And what that does is it holds a fluid called synovial fluid that lubricates this bone-to-bone contact. Technically, it's going to lubricate this cartilage to cartilage contact, because your freely moving joints, as I said before, are going to be wrapped in hyaline cartilage, making this gap here as friction-free as possible. So let's talk about the different joints that we have. We have a gliding joint, and we see a gliding joint between the metatarsals, which are the bones of the foot. A hinge joint is pretty self-explanatory, and the classic spot for a hinge joint is your knee and your elbow, and they are very similar to the hinge on a door or a gate. A pivoting joint, this allows us to twist. So we see a pivoting joint in between atlas and axis. And atlas and axis are the top two vertebrae in your vertebral column. It's what allows us to turn our heads. And so when you turn to look right or left, when you turn your head, your skull and your top vertebrae, C1 or atlas, don't really move apart from each other very much. But C1 and C2 is where all that rotation takes place. So when you turn to the left, atlas goes, the C1 vertebrae goes with your skull, but the C2 stays put. And so instead of pivoting between your skull and the top vertebrae, you pivot between the top vertebrae and the second vertebrae in your neck. Those very specialized cervical vertebrae, and that's why they have their own individual names of atlas C1 and axis C2. You also see a pivoting joint between the radius and the ulna. This is what allows us to roll our hand over. So you can stick your hand out, palm down, and then you can easily rotate your forearm to go palm up and vice versa. And when you do that, the radius will pivot around the ulna, and that's where the pivoting joint comes from. An ellipsoidal joint is one we see where the phalanges meet the metacarpals. All right, so this circle is just a little low. The bones of the hand are the metacarpals, and that would be this one and these four. And these three are phalanges, so that joint is going to be right there, and right there. Those are your ellipsoidal joints. A saddle joint is named because it looks like a saddle, and that is where your thumb the metacarpal of your thumb meets the carpal in your wrist. And here in the not too distant future, we'll be talking about the names of these of those individual carpals. That one is going to be the trapezium. Spoiler alert. The ball and socket joint, we see that in 4 places in your body. In your hip, where your femur meets your pelvic girdle or pelvis, And then we also see it where the head of your humerus articulates with the glenoid cavity or glenoid fossa of your scapula and shoulder blade, and the acromial end of your clavicle. But we'll talk more about that here shortly. And it is a ball that fits into the socket. And as you can see here, this ball fits into that depression in the pelvis called the acetabulum. And we were talking about osteoporosis in old people. This is the greater trochanter. And when they fall, they land on this point. That's the point when you reach down and feel the outside of your hip and you feel that bone inside there. That's what we're talking about. And so when the old person falls and they land on this, that blow will break the femur right there at the neck. And so they technically, when they say they fall and they quote unquote break their hip, many times they technically break the head off the femur, and that's where the fracture occurs. But that is a ball and socket joint. And that is it for lesson 4 and all of the lecture material on bone tissue. All right, that's it. That is the last video in the series on bone tissue of the skeletal system. So congratulations, you've made it through. And now we get to start working on bone identification and the different markings and processes on these bones. So as always, thanks for watching. If you have any questions, shoot me an email and we'll talk to you later.